very warm welcome, everybody, to another highlight of our open lecture hall, Stockholm plus 50, 5 decades of global environmental governance. This week, governments meet again in Stockholm, 50 years after the first international conference on the human environment. And at the same time, we realize that our lifestyles, especially energy supply, come at a very high price, including, but not only, environmental costs. My name is Lena Partsch. I'm professor of comparative politics with a focus on environmental and climate politics at the Otto Institute. And it's a great honor today to welcome Andreas Goldthau from the University of Erfurt. He's an energy expert, so today we will hear about global energy governance. And I organized this lecture series together with several students, including Marco. And Andreas, before the floor is yours, Marco is going to introduce you. Then you have 45 minutes for your talk, followed by a Q&A session. And we're recording this session again, including the Q&A session. Therefore, when you ask your questions afterwards, please use the microphone. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is our pleasure to introduce you today's speaker, Professor Andreas Goldthau. Professor Goldthau is the director of the Willy Brandt Institute for Public Policy at the University of Erfurt and currently holds the Franz Haniel Professorship for Public Policy. He has been leading research groups and projects on global energy transition, on energy policy and governance, including the Is project on energy justice and the Global South. ICGAT stands for Investigating the Systemic Impacts of the Global Energy Transition. And it's located at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. Professor Goldthau also served as a professor in international relations at Royal Holloway College at the University of London, and also as a professor at the Central European University. And he was also a Marie Curie Senior Fellow with the Geopolitics of Energy project at the Harvard Kennedy School, and also an adjunct professor with the Johns Hopkins MSc program in Energy Policy and Climate. He also had postdoctoral appointments at Paul Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. So it's our pleasure to have us the lecturer of Professor Goldthau.
Thank you. Thanks for the very kind and warm welcome. And let me just very quickly try and get that one done. Ah, that's how it goes. Excellent, thanks so much. Great, thanks for the interest, and thanks everybody who's tuning in on the live stream. It's a great pleasure to be here. Actually, it's not the first time that I'm here. I studied here, and it was actually some 25 years ago that I enrolled at this university, and at this time around we still had diplomas and things that have gone completely missing, for the better, I think. And So I've been in this room once in a while, listening to people who knew stuff that I always wanted to know about, and now I'm up here. This is fantastic, and this is a great pleasure. It's an honor, and thanks, Lena, for inviting me. It is not only great to be back, it's also a great pleasure to be part of that lecture series, which I think is very timely and which is very important. And I think what Lena quickly alluded to, I mean, we're facing multiple crises these days, all of which are more or less exacerbated by the sustainability challenge, the climate challenge that we're facing. And I'm also honored to be amongst several speakers that I think very highly of. You had Miranda Shorias kicking off the whole series, which is a well-respected colleague. I've seen Philipp Pattberg coming along a little bit later, probably talking about Earth systems governance. And there's a whole bunch of other people who I think bring tremendous value to this conversation. So from that end, a great honor as well. What I was asked by Lena to talk about a little bit today is clean energy services, universal access as an enabler for development ? And I'm not entirely sure I can give a full answer to that question. Probably not. In fact, I won't. But what I'll try and do is I'll connect the dots a little bit for you. And I'm not going to be overly theoretical. I have a chair for public policy, so we ask very tangible questions and try and answer them in a straightforward manner. But what I'll do is I'll throw a bunch of descriptive stats at you and see what we can make of them. And by all means, this is not necessarily me lecturing for 45 minutes or so. You can always jump in and interrupt me anytime if you think I should go deeper or clarify rather. But before I do any of that, let me just quickly stress that this is a joint exercise. I'm working with Nopinho Dabla from the International Renewable Energy Agency at the moment on all things energy access. In fact, actually, we're authoring a chapter for Lena's forthcoming book, and I'm honored to team up with him because he has been working in sub-Saharan Africa on all things energy access for years and years and years. So the Kenya case study that I'm going to quickly present a little bit later, that's his work, and he would probably, certainly be a lot more suitable to walk you through that. I'll try my best, and I hope I give him due justice. Let's jump right into this and simply start by saying, what is the state of affairs of energy access? And the long and short of it is, there's some good news and there's some bad news to it. The good news is, we have essentially lifted 1.1 billion people out of energy poverty and brought them into energy access over the past 2 decades. That's in part China, but that's in great part also other countries that have done their bit to enhance access to electricity. And that's very, very good news. There is, however, and what you can see at this map, there also is still a number of countries, whole regions in fact, that don't tend to be doing that well. Parts of Southeast Asia are not connected to the grid. Parts of Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, are areas where a lower percentage of the population has access to electricity. Now, you may say, well, why is this important in the first place? And obviously, there's a normative premise to this, and I come back to this. But just imagine what would happen without electricity. We would not be standing in this room or sitting in this room. I would not be able to give that lecture. We would not look at the screen. There would be no camera that would connect us to the rest of the world and everyone who's following live out there. There would be no way to actually stream things into the internet so that people can live stream wherever they are. Electricity, defined as modern energy services, is the linchpin of our energy system. It is the linchpin of our economic system. Without electricity, you cannot study. Without electricity, you cannot do your homework in the evenings. Without electricity, you cannot run a hospital. Without electricity, you cannot store medicine or anything else that you need to store for more than a day. Electricity is crucial. So access to the grid is something that is vital for countries to provide human development and for people to become active in economic terms beyond very basic ways of interaction. But there is more. It's not only about running hospitals and making sure you can study. What it is essentially is it connects you to the knowledge economy. Because no one reads books anymore. Well, you may, and books are a great thing to do, and I have tons of books at home, but I don't read them because of me wanting to increase my knowledge. I do this because of this being a pleasure to me. The way you get your knowledge and the way you increase knowledge and the way you tab on knowledge is by way of tabbing on knowledge hubs that are virtual. And that's precisely how our economies run these days. We're talking cloud services. We're talking databases, which no one has on their computer. They're all somewhere in the web, and they're hosted in places that you have to have access to. So essentially what a lack of electricity access means is you're deprived of opportunity, economic opportunity, and you're deprived of a possibility to participate in the global knowledge economy. There is another aspect to the energy access conundrum that I quickly want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit less in my presentation, but it's equally important, and that's clean cooking. One is electricity. The other is essentially how you produce things that you need for your daily lives, including your meals and how you make them. The traditional way of doing this in many places still is by way of using biomass, wood, dung, whatsoever. If you're able to afford, you can use kerosene. But the problem is both of them are fossil, or at least not very healthy when it comes to biomass and other forms of feedstock for cooking services. The problem here is not necessarily them being polluting. That's one problem. The bigger problem is that a lot of that happens as part of indoor combustion. So people cook at home, but they cook with biomass. People cook at home, but they cook with kerosene. And that means you have a lot of indoor pollution, which triggers all sorts of things, including respiratory diseases and a bad living environment. On top of that, if a couple of million people do it at the same time, it actually means cities get polluted. Cities get polluted because of many reasons, because of them running on coal-fired power plants, for instance, for the electricity access, because cars are polluting running on old combustion engines, but also because people use traditional cooking fuels for daily needs. And here the picture is even more bleak than when it comes to electricity access. We're talking about roughly 2.6 billion people across the globe. And again, sub-Saharan Africa is a hotspot here. This is roughly 900 million people out of those 2.6 that are in Africa. But also Southeast Asia. Think about, you can see it well on this map, think about Bangladesh, think about Pakistan, think about Vietnam, Malaysia, even Mongolia, places that when it comes to electricity access do well, they don't necessarily do that well when it comes to clean cooking. Less of an economic problem, it's less of a problem related to economic activity, productivity, and all these kind of things. It's more a health-related problem, and there's a gender component to this. And if we have time, we can get to that. The sub-Saharan African region accounts for almost 35% of the 2.6 billion. So you have a hotspot there, if you will, and it is a challenge that a whole bunch of countries are still grappling with. So what we're looking at here is a conundrum that points various ways in various directions. The way I think about this, and the way I try and structure my talk a little bit, is by way of thinking about this along two lines. One is the climate dimension. The other is a normative dimension. When it comes to climate, essentially we got to go back a little bit and ask, how do we develop? What does the history of mankind actually tell us about economic development? And the answer is, economic development has traditionally come in tandem with higher energy consumption. So the moment you start growing as an economy, the moment you start developing towards higher levels of economic activity, more sophisticated levels of economic activity, the moment you start industrializing, what that means is your energy consumption goes up. And there's a direct correlation between economic development and energy consumption. We've seen this in the past. We've seen this in the UK, which first industrialized, and then in the European continent, on the European continent, in Germany, in Italy, and in other countries. We've seen this in the US, we've seen this in China, and we're now seeing this in India. Now, the problem is additional energy consumption ideally would not come from fossil fuels. Because if we end up adding additional generation capacity to the global energy system by way of fostering fossil systems and fossil infrastructure, we end up burning the planet. We will never ever be able to reach the Paris Agreement, the Paris targets, and the climate goals. So the point here is energy access and the energy access challenge needs to be overcome. And yes, that means adding a lot of people to the grid and allowing them to access better and more modern cooking fuels. But it has to be done without adding additional greenhouse gas emissions to the balance. So closing the energy gap must not come with future emissions. And that's the biggest challenge here. So connecting people to the grid, one thing. Connecting to a grid that's green, a different story. The other thing here goes back a little bit to what I talked about before. At the very end, we're looking at an energy justice issue. It's not only about closing some gaps. The challenge here is essentially one of human development. Equal chances and opportunity for people across the globe. And that entails everything from a more equal opportunity amongst gender or across gender, and equal opportunity when it comes to economic activity and the way you can put your skills to work in order to grow and in order to become economically active in the way that you think you would like to become active. Energy access is crucial to that. So you have two things. You have a climate dimension, you have a normative premise. And I would very much like us to keep that in mind throughout the next couple of minutes and the rest of the conversation. Which quickly, just as a reminder, gets us to what is Stg7 in the first place. And yes, it is about universal energy access, but it is defined as a goal to achieve affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all by 2030. So you have it all in there. It's about modern energy services, electricity, clean fuels, sustainable energy services, and that means you don't add additional greenhouse gas emissions to the balance. And yes, it has to be affordable in addition to being reliable. You can't have patchy services because that's not how you run your electricity system ideally, and it would hamper your economic activity the moment you do that, or the moment you have that. So you have an affordability aspect, you have a sustainability aspect, and you have an access aspect. There are a couple of tenets, and this is now we're getting into the UN language. I don't want to bore you with that, but the point here is essentially people talk about various SDGs, 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3. I would very much look at 1 and 2. I'm very much interested in this conversation in universal energy access and renewable energy because of the climate dimension attached to it. We can talk a little bit about energy efficiency, but that's yet another conversation. And also relates to the fact that energy efficiency is not only about using energy more efficiently, it's also about essentially getting to a point where economies no longer grow their energy consumption in conjunction with their economic activity, but at some point, hopefully, they decouple economic activity from energy consumption. Most all OECD economies have done this. At some point, we have decoupled. We're still growing, and we're still adding economic growth every year to our economies, but we no longer grow our energy consumption. That's for a bunch of reasons, including energy efficiency and us becoming simply very, very efficient in the way we do things. But the dirty little secret here is also because of other reasons. Among other, the very fact that we ended up outsourcing some of the dirty stuff to other economies in parts of the world that have less stringent environmental or climate targets and regulations, and or are cheaper. So it's both. It's us becoming better at what we do, but also focusing on things that pollute less. Service industry instead of, say, steel industry. There's a little bit of steel left in this country, but not that much. That's outfarmed to India and a whole bunch of other places where emissions now occur. So that's part of the decoupling story. But SDG 7.3 here is related to the idea that it's not only about accessing or allowing people to get access to the grid, it's also about making sure to do this in an efficient way so that at some point they can start decoupling. Not for now, for a different conversation. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper and ask, how do we get there and how do we get where we are? Just a few descriptive stats. I quickly hinted at that, but I think it's important to remind ourselves that we have come a long way. In terms of energy access, the world is getting better and better and better. And this is very good news. Just look at the success story of Southeast Asia. They started essentially, well, somewhere in the 50s, when it comes to the percentage of the population that has access to electricity. About 20 years ago now, they're at 100%. This is a tremendous achievement. In part, it's China, but it's also other parts of developing Asia. There's a couple of countries and regions that did not do that well, and what you see here is, among other, sub-Saharan Africa. It's not a flat or sideways movement, but it's not a steep process either. So there is development there, but it's not as forceful as you have it in other places. And particularly if you start unpacking sub-Saharan Africa and Central Africa, and I've given you a couple of countries on the right graph, you see tremendous differences. I mean, for the sake of the argument, Mali, for instance, has done pretty well. They came from their 30s in terms of percentage points of population having access to the grid, and they are now very much high up on par, essentially, with many parts of Southeast Asia. And then you have places like Rwanda or Sierra Leone that did not do that well at all, Somalia being somewhere in between. A success story that I will tell you about in more detail a little bit later is Kenya. Kenya started at 28% access rate in some 20 years ago, and they're now at 75%. So the point is, there is tremendous differences amongst countries that otherwise are pretty similar. And maybe just one additional point here. I think it's always important to bear in mind that access rates as such doesn't tell you very much about how many people are connected to the grid. For the sake of the argument, in 2000, the electricity rate in sub-Saharan Africa was overall 24%. 500 million people were off the grid. Now, in 2020, we're talking 48%. But because of a tremendous growth in population, we have now 576 million people off the grid, more than in 2020. So access rates went up, but because of population growth, you still have a growing number of people not being connected. But again, the good news is we got somewhere, and more than that, it is a very, very promising trend. You get a similar story at the moment you look at clean cooking. What I plotted here, and I used IEA numbers, actually, these are numbers and data that come from the Tracking Stg7 report that they do together with a whole bunch of other international organizations. And what I did is I essentially plotted, on the one hand, and that's the orange bars. I plotted for you the growth in population across region. And that compares, and that's the blue bars, population that was added, the number of people that were added to the grid and have additional access. And ideally what you want to see here is essentially the blue bar exceeding the orange bar. Right? So yes, countries grow, but the number of people you connect to the grid grows faster. And that really happens across the board. It happened also in Western and Northern Africa, where essentially you have an equal number of people being added in terms of population, and the same number of people being connected to the grid. It does not happen in sub-Saharan Africa, though. So sub-Saharan Africa is a place where you have strong population growth, but the number of people being added, sorry, not to the grid, people who have access to clean cooking is not happening at the same speed. To the contrary, actually what we've seen over the last year or two, and that's in part COVID and Corona, and the tremendous economic effects that had on those countries and their purchasing power, what we've seen is that people actually went back to traditional cooking fuels. And that happened mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, where a good part of the 50 million that you see here went back. That's bad news, because that, again, gets you into problems related to human health, the ways, the pollution levels of cities, the quality of the environment and human environment, and so on and so forth. One more thing that I think, just in terms of descriptive stats, might be interesting. There is an important difference between urban and rural areas. So, generally, as a rule of thumb, urban areas are connected to the grid much better than rural areas. That's not super surprising, simply because urban areas are densely, well, they're very dense. Infrastructure's there. You can build on top of existing infrastructure. And you typically also have the means and the ends to do all this. It's much more difficult in rural areas where you have much larger areas that you need to cover, population is much more patchy, and costs per capita, if you will, to get them to the grid are a lot higher, because you got to build all the infrastructure to connect them. But still, what you see is, in fact, an interesting pattern here. I just plotted 3 countries: India, Kenya, and Malawi. India almost managed to bring the rural areas on par with urban areas when it comes to electricity access. Kenya did did good progress, and as I said, a little bit earlier, it's kind of a success story. Malawi did not. So in the end, it's not only overall access rates in urban areas that hover around 50%. It's also very, very low access areas in the rural domain. And now can you ask yourself the question, why is this? And there's various reasons why this is. The first is that generally it's very difficult in fast-growing urban areas to maintain a high level or to add to an existing level of electricity access. And that has a lot to do with settlements, dwellings that happen without planning in areas where urban development was not foreseen, illegal settlements, slums, essentially phenomena that we know from many parts of the world. And that's because of planning being difficult, because of energy investment being difficult. Just think about a developer. How do they move in and try and develop an area that as such evolved organically, but without big infrastructure planning behind it? You don't even have clear property rights when it comes to claims of land. How do you build stuff on it if you want to develop a certain infrastructure? These are all questions that are very, very difficult. So the informality of those settlements prevents additional electricity access from happening in those cities. But then you also have, and that's a very different conversation and a very different aspect, then you also have a strong correlation between countries being fragile, vulnerable, or conflict-prone, and low access levels when it comes to electricity. So generally, a country is poor, low energy access levels. That's straightforward. And it has a lot to do with public power, if you will, just to use that wonderful term, and financial power in that sense, to also provide for some of the public goods that you need in order to guarantee energy access, infrastructure, transmission lines, all these kind of things. But fragile environments are also, in terms of conflict-prone environments, are also they also correlate strongly with low access levels, and that is to do with a very different question. It has a lot to do with investment environment, the degree to which people are willing to put private money into developing infrastructure. Business cases simply not being there, time horizons being very short. If you don't know precisely what the political environment is going to be in 1 or 2 or 3 years, you don't know what the regulatory environment will be. But your infrastructure investment will need to pay off, particularly when it comes to renewable-based infrastructure, because one of the things that distinguishes renewable from fossil fuel infrastructure is that renewable energy infrastructure, particularly when it comes to solar and wind and the generation part, it's very upfront heavy when it comes to investments. So you got a high upfront investment. Maintenance is then not very cost intensive. But what you got to do is you got to recoup the initial investment, which is relatively high, over a couple of years. And for that you need time, and you need to have an idea of how your return on investment is going to be. The moment we're looking at conflict environments or fragile environments, volatile environments in terms of economic or political stability, you do not get that return on investment, which means regardless of whether people need the energy infrastructure and the services, it's just not going to happen. And that gets us into another element, again, descriptive stats. I'm still at the problem. Another aspect of it, which is affordability. Now, just to move a little bit away from the non-OECD world, let's be clear, this is a problem that we know as well in Europe. And I assume most of you are more or less from this continent, one way or the other. What you get as a rule of thumb is the further south and southeast you go in Europe, plus Portugal, energy poverty levels tend to be relatively high. And energy poverty is essentially defined as whether or not you're able to keep your home adequately warm, a very European definition that if you go to the global south and many places, that will be a very different definition. It's not about keeping houses warm, but keeping temperatures at adequate levels and cool them down. So that already gets you to a part of the problem. For a long time, we haven't even measured energy poverty. That's the definition by Eurostat. Whether you are able to keep your house warm, adequately warm. But we don't have it featured in, say, the World Development Index and the various indicators going into it. So we measure poverty, we don't measure energy poverty. And we are able to define something along those lines, as you see here for Europe, but we don't have such a definition and data actually for other parts of the world, particularly not parts of the world that generally don't tend to be very prone to excessive data gathering. Generally, obviously, if you think about energy poverty, it's something along the lines of disposable income and the share of which you spend on energy services. So it's not the absolute levels of electricity supply, of electricity prices that matter, but it's essentially which share you spend of your available income on those energy services. And on top of that, you know, the questions arise related to energy efficiency and so on and so forth. Because we don't have data for affordability for non-OECD contexts, we've got to look at what we find, and what you get is, for instance, a good measure by way of looking at ISMAP's RISE indicators. So essentially a stack of indicators put on top of each other, including the cost of subsistence consumption, the connection fee, and policies to support poor households. All of this goes into that score. So it doesn't, what you see here, it doesn't measure whether energy is affordable as such, but it tells you something on whether those three indicators, how these three indicators come together. And the long and the short here is India is doing pretty well, and Chad is not. And now again, you can go back and ask yourself, what is the correlation that I'm seeing here? And I guess what we're seeing here is conflict. We're seeing fragile environments. We're seeing essentially all of the indicators that I talked about before. So again, when it comes to affordability and that dimension of energy poverty, that's precisely a pattern that not only is visible when it comes to energy access, is also something that we see when it comes to the cost dimension of it. Now, the next question you got to ask is, how do we solve all this? Is there what do the numbers tell us about efforts to tackle the energy access challenge, not only as an infrastructure challenge, but also as one that ideally responds by way of bringing up additional electricity capacity, clean capacity. And what I did is I just plotted a few numbers for you here, and those numbers are give you the capacity investment in renewables 2019. 2019 is a good measure because 2020 was a bit of a year, as we know. 21 wasn't great either, and 22 is not over. So the best number to deal with, or the best numbers to look at, probably is 2019. And the long and short of it really is that globally, in 2019, we saw an overall investment of around $280 or $82 billion going into renewables. That's solar, wind, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the good news about that number is that more than half of it went to the non-OECD world. So that's the right bar. That hasn't always been like that. So if you go back 10 years, the majority would have gone into the OECD world. That has changed. But it has changed because of essentially one country, and that's China. So what you see here in this orange part of the right bar is China and India lumped together, but in the end it's China, more or less, which make up for a great chunk of the non-OECD world and the renewable energy investment that goes there. The developed world is the blue bar, and everything else is all countries except for the OECD world, China and India. All of Africa, all of Latin America, all of Southeast Asia. So what you get here already is a pretty clear idea. If we try and kind of solve the energy access problem by way of deploying renewables at scale, they probably need to go places where they don't go at the moment. So they need to go to places which, if you look at the left bar, aren't even mentioned. Africa is not on it, if you see. It's simply because they don't get enough renewable energy investment to count for that bar. The other Americas aren't great either. So there is a lopsided investment pattern, and that lopsided investment pattern obviously presents a problem because of investments going to places where you have present emissions, not future emissions. The future emissions will be in Africa. The future emissions will be in Southeast Asia, because that's where most of the population growth is, and that's where most of the economic growth will happen going forward. That's where renewable energy capacity needs to be built right now. If it is not built, we don't solve the energy access problem, at least not when it comes to clean energy access, and we will not be able to avoid the future emissions that come with that. There is a lot to be said, and maybe we'll have a little bit of time later. There's a lot to be said about the role of the international community in helping here. The World Bank is active. There's a Green Climate Fund that's being set up. It's not working fully. It's not fully staffed despite pledges. But there is a lot happening, particularly when it comes to de-risking local projects, when it comes to giving them a business case, when it comes to lowering the risk for individual investors, particularly against the backdrop of a lot of uncertainty on the ground when it comes to asking whether they can recoup the money they put in. But this is precisely one of the key areas where the international community needs to happen going forward, needs to put a lot more emphasis on going forward. If you look at the national level, there is, in fact, a lot of stuff happening that's interesting and worth reporting. And here I get to my short Kenya case study, which Nopenyo did for us in the piece. Essentially, if you look at Kenya, and if you look at energy access rates in comparison, so what I did here is I benchmarked Kenya, that's the blue thick bar, or the blue thick line. I benchmarked them against fragile and conflict areas, sub-Saharan Africa more generally, and least developed countries. What you see is they outperform everyone. They come from a 28% access rate 20 years ago, they're at 75. Absolute success story. Very interesting. And what you get really is, if you look at their Stg7 profile, they're not doing great on clean cooking, different story, but electricity rates are great and renewable energy rates are great. Now you got to ask yourself, why is this? And is there anything that we can learn from it against the backdrop of the stories that I told you? And the answer is yes, we can learn something. There's a couple things we identified, and we can go into detail if you want, but I guess it all boils down to essentially a committed government, planning long time horizons, and the right level of decision-making when it comes to tackling the energy access challenge. So around 20 years ago, the Kenyan government decided they tackled the challenge, and they set up long-term plans with a clear focus on grid and rule on on-grid and rule, that means often off-grid electrification. What did they do for it? An Energy Act that did a couple of things, including setting up a regulatory commission that was independent, which is important. Very often countries have a regulator that's identical to the company producing electricity or other energy services. It's not the greatest thing to do. If you do it in an independent way, you can actually think about tariffs, licensing, network contracts, and all these kind of things without having to think about your own product. And that's precisely what happened. So it was an independent body for the power sector, coupled with a rural electrification authority that had a specific mandate, and that was, to accelerate essentially anything that happens on the rural area. They also got a fund supporting their efforts, and that pertains particularly to some of the public goods aspects of the infrastructure that is needed in order to electrify parts of the of the rural parts of the country, and they started working with essentially a policy mix that we know well. We know this from this country. You either subsidize something that you want or exempt it from costs, and that's precisely what they did. They exempted solar and other renewables from taxes and tariffs and gave them a competitive edge, plus, importantly, no subsidies for fossil stuff, which is rare because in many places, India, for instance, is a very good example. They have been struggling to get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies forever and don't manage. The Kenyans didn't start them in the first place. And that helps because the moment multilateral institutions join in the de-risking of local projects, what you get is the fastest growing African market for decentralized renewables. So I'm cutting a very long story very short, but I guess what you see here is a smart policy mix and a determined government that provided for precisely the incentives and lowered the barriers for everything that I reported on a little bit earlier, allowing Kenya to become an interesting place for renewable developers and giving them essentially a good case to put the money into the country because governments cannot pull that off on their own. They're not the only ones. So going back a little bit to the RISE index, and this is just essentially what you get the moment you start fiddling around with the database a little bit. Going back to the RISE index, what you see is essentially the fastest growing electricity markets. Is that a pointer? No, there's no pointer. If the fastest electricity markets are all on the upper level of that chart. So they're all doing essentially something along the lines of what Kenya did. EaseMap, they lump these things into categories like monitoring and support and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into the details of how they built the indicator, but the point here is most of what Kenya did well, those other countries are doing well as well, and that correlates quite directly with their success when it comes to developing local and national renewable energy markets and scaling them up. Now that begs two more questions, and that's where I come to an end. The first question is really, will SDGs allow us to tackle other questions and other challenges? And particularly, will the SDG7 help other SDGs? So will universal energy access allow us to tackle development, poverty, and other questions? Essentially, what the long and the short of it is, for most part, yes. And I saw Manuel Fischer was here, so I will not repeat what he can do a lot better. But there's a lot to be said about empowering people. There's a lot to be said about technology innovation. There's a lot to be said about respiratory diseases. There's a lot to be said about health. And healthier people are more productive, so that helps, again, the goal of poverty alleviation. Cities become a lot more sustainable the moment you switch from dirty to clean fossil cooking fuels. And that obviously also feeds into an efficient use of natural resources, particularly when it comes to daily needs. So all of that, that's, I think, that's agreed, fact in the literature, contributes to combating dangerous climate change and helps SDGs. So there is something to be said about clean energy access enabling a lot of other things that you want to achieve. So SDG7 is somewhat of a nexus within the whole SDG conundrum. But let's not kid ourselves. We might actually see important trade-offs as well. I'll give you a few. Think about land use. In this country, we're having a very, very fierce conversation, if that's still called a conversation, amongst various stakeholders around the siting of, say, wind farms. And that has a lot to do with them not liking them, but it also has a lot to do with the question for what it is that you use land. Want to put solar PVs there? Do you want to put wind farms there? Or do you want to do something else with that. And in the non-OECD world, that also boils down immediately to questions such as food production. So that starts pitting renewables against food security. I mean, I'm not sure when you went through some of the major solar plants, one of the major solar plants in Europe last time around, they're massive. So land use is an issue. And it's not only an issue when it comes to solar and wind, it's also an issue when it comes to biofuels. That gets us into something that Lena has written about herself. Essentially, the whole idea that, the moment you start using agricultural land for biofuels, other types of lands are repurposed, like wetlands or rainforests or grasslands or other things. So you get an indirect land use change, which threatens biodiversity, which may even, in fact, increase greenhouse gas emissions, because the moment you dry out wetlands, you lose a lot of the carbon sink. Think about water resources. And the only pointer that I'd like to make here is towards large-scale hydro, which people have studied and essentially found to clash with ways local populations manage natural resources. And particularly traditional ways of managing the local habitat. But there's more. Solar PVs, wind farms, they don't necessarily work without, or they don't work at all, without critical minerals and rare earth materials. Batteries don't do that either. In order to extract those, you essentially put a tremendous pressure on certain parts of local communities, particularly mining communities. There's a lot of toxicity involved in that extraction, which means the effort to go green and to provide clean energy access on one end actually means toxic impact for local ecosystems on other ends and the communities that live in them. That gets people like scholars like Benjamin Sovacool and others to talk about a decarbonization divide, even within countries. Some people go happily green and get access to the energy grid, whilst others essentially end up in toxic mining facilities. And a final thing that I quickly wanted to point to, a final trade-off, which I think we need to bear in mind, is the very fact that when it comes to the Paris Agreement, we have a principle there. And the principle is the common but differentiated responsibility. Essentially, the whole idea is that rich countries go first in decarbonizing their energy systems because they polluted for longest. They have eaten up most of the carbon sink. Now it's on them to pay for the technology learning curve so that others can come later and go happily green the moment costs are down. So it's a question of energy justice. But the problem is, the moment you think about energy access as something that can for a while still be fossil, you start locking in carbon. Why is this? Well, because every dollar that you invest in fossil infrastructure is a dollar that will get stuck in fossil infrastructure that's going to stick around for a decade or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. A coal-fired power plant lives for 50 years. So every decision that you take right now when it comes to energy access creates path dependency when it comes to your energy system. So that wonderful principle is great. In practice, it means you lock in carbon for future generations, not something that you want to do. And on top of that, it violates the principle of fighting climate change. So the point here really is, yes, there's a lot of synergies between the SDG7 and other SDGs, but there might actually be a lot of trade-offs as well between those. And that lands us essentially in the one question that I was asked to answer in this talk today, which is universal access an enabler for development? And I guess my point here is, I'm not so convinced about that. And the reason why I'm not so convinced is because there is a premise behind the idea that clean energy access fosters economic growth and economic advancement. And the idea is essentially that the moment you get clean technology into a country, the moment you start scaling this up, the moment you enable people to become economically active, that gets, on a clean basis, that gets you a push towards green industrialization. And there's something to that argument. I mean, there's various ways in which economies can grow. They can grow because population grows, that's endogenous growth, but they can also grow because of technology advancement. And technologies help you grow. And that's precisely the argument behind green industrialization. You bring clean technologies into a country that scales up the way in which the country pursues economic activity, which in the end leads to an economic growth path. My problem with that argument is essentially that we know something about technology and what it does in countries, particularly if it doesn't originate from a given country. And that is to do with the different types of technology transfer you have. The moment you think about solar PVs, windmills, biofuel technology, and all these kind of things that we just talked about, the moment you start bringing them into a country, because you start de-risking, because you get the local environment right, because you do what Kenya did, you get the hardware into the country. Solar PVs, windmills, these kind of things. And that's great. That's precisely what you want to do because you enhance energy access. You hook people onto the grid, and you make all of this work in a green manner, in a clean way. But that's hardware. What may come with it is skills. That's your flow B, according to Bell. And that's the standard model here. It may come with skills. So that's know-how when it comes to maintenance, operation. Great thing to have because that's where a lot of the service industry is. Good thing to have. But the one thing that barely happens is flow C, and that's knowledge. You don't know how to build these things. You do not become part of the value chain, and you don't capture part of the value creation of that technology. And the reason why it doesn't happen is there's many reasons for that. One of them is because the absorptive capacity of a lot of countries that are subject to technology transfer is not big enough. The innovation ecosystem cannot absorb the tech coming in. And that means they're stuck with the hardware. Now that's fine, but what it does is it enhances your ways to produce in a green way, and that's good. What it does not do is, unless you get the knowledge transfer in place, it does not help your innovation capacity and capability. And that's precisely what fosters industrialization. So what I think is that clean energy access is something that we need to do. It needs to happen. We're on a good way. It changes people's lives and realities. It fosters human development. Yes, it creates local welfare, but it is most probably not yielding a green industrialization in developing countries. For that, a lot more needs to happen. And I guess the baseline here is let's communicate the universal energy access challenge and the solutions to it in a way that they should be communicated. It's a human development issue, it's an energy justice issue, but this is not about industrialization. And it's still very, very important. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I'm greatly looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
So many thanks to Professor Goldthau for the really interesting lecture. I really want to cut short this conclusion because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions, and I want to address as many as possible. So without further ado, first questions.
Okay, now first of all, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. Also because the topic is very timely, I would say, regarding the conflict that we have on our doorsteps, basically. And I wanted to ask you how you think that the perception of energy policy, in particular referred to security, I would say, has changed, if it has changed according to you, especially after the war in Ukraine, and if this could lead to a positive change in what we just heard regarding renewables. So if there's a higher chance that states move towards renewable in order to become independent, this is one of the main topics, or if, on the contrary, as it is happening in some countries in Europe, they will move back to, for instance, coal or non-renewable sources. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. That's a great question, and obviously spot on. Let me just maybe say two things. One, we're seeing something almost paradoxical happening at the moment, and that's fossil fuels essentially seeing a comeback in Europe, but also elsewhere. In Europe, particularly because of some very hectic policy responses to a looming and urgent crisis. So what we're seeing is a lot of money being poured into liquefaction or regasification capacity for LNG, liquid natural gas. We're having discussions around prolonging the lifetime of coal-fired power plants. There is additional effort in securing long-term contracts for gas supplies from other countries other than Russia. And all of that essentially is in response to an urgent and dire crisis. At the same time, however, we're seeing some very interesting efforts being made to wean ourselves off of precisely the stuff that got us into trouble in the first place. And just a few numbers here. I mean, the German government decided to put another 200 billion into climate measures, as part of which quite a bit of money will go into the energy transition and renewables. Offshore wind targets just got quadrupled in this country. A couple of days ago, the Belgian, the Danish, the Dutch, and the German government decided to essentially turn, or presented plans to turn the North Sea into a green power plant, including offshore floating facilities producing green hydrogen, which would then replace other types of molecules, fossil molecules, and that's natural gas. And then we see the Repower EU plan, which will be instrumental in flanking all of this on the European level, with additional funds being put in there, but also with a master plan behind it when it comes to green hydrogen and the green hydrogen economy being ramped up within a very short period of time. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because we're seeing, on the one hand, short-term solutions that are fossil, but then we see something that we should have seen for a long time already, a rush actually towards renewables and clean transitions, fuel switches, but also demand-side measures that are now being fostered, and essentially what it means, it puts the European energy transition on steroids. So in a couple of years, we'll see the value of this and the payoff of this. There's going to be a couple of years in between that will make the European, or where the European energy system will still be vulnerable, 4 or 5 years maybe, something like that, where natural gas is still an important part of the system, not fully replaced and not fully replaceable. So this is a little bit of a delicate dance for those couple of years until we'll see the emergence of a green hydrogen economy, particularly in areas where you need heat services, not electricity. So process heat, steel industry, car industry, everything where you need process heat. that's precisely where molecules become important. You can't do that with electrons, or for most part it's difficult. So a couple of years of a delicate dance, but then it's going to pay off simply because of the tremendous amounts of investments that are being put in at the moment. Why is this made possible? Well, because we just securitized renewable energy. The moment Mr. Lindner, the finance minister of this wonderful country, stood up and said, it's freedom energy, Freiheitsenergie. He securitized renewables. He said, this is about national security, it's about national freedom. Freedom from an enemy. And what you do with that, the moment you give renewable energy such a tag, is you do two things essentially. One is you take renewables and you take it out of the climate box and the environmental box and the sustainability box and the birds and frogs box. And you put it into the security box. And you say, come what may, we do that. And that's precisely, second point, that's precisely where extraordinary measures become possible. So if there are trade-offs, you have an answer. If the question is whether you save birds or national security, you save national security. And that allows cutting short on planning time, on regulatory, cutting down on regulatory red tape and all these kind of things. Some of which are totally debatable, don't get me wrong. But essentially the point is, because of the Ukraine war and the Russian aggression and that brutal war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, things have been made possible by way of putting renewables from one box into the other, and that allows accelerating the whole energy transition. Quick final point on the non-OECD world. Here, I think the picture is a little bit bleaker. And that's not only because of them following a different rationale, it's particularly because we're at the moment seeing capital shying away from a lot of the emerging markets, in part because of interest rates going up in the US and in part going forward also in Europe. That means capital is fleeing those countries and shifts west or north, rather. And it also means that some of the capital flows that were at the margin were it wasn't entirely clear, what the next destination might be, now have a clear destination. That's north, not south. So what I see going forward, for many reasons, and in part because of that, what I see going forward is a more difficult investment environment in the non-OECD world, particularly in emerging markets. And that may impact also on the degree to which they can manage the energy transition. At the very moment, it hinges on capital.
Thank you very much for your insightful talk. Connected to that, this rush to renewables, some critics also say, is because of dependencies that are grounded on a long-term miss-out of this clean energy transition. So I'm asking myself, is within Europe, is the achievement of SDG7 goals still doable despite the energy crisis we have now? And also, will this delay the transition to cleaner energy sources in the rest of the world, because they're dependent also on foreign investments and of developing money coming into this? Thank you.
Well, when it comes to Europe, and that's a great question. I mean, it's complex. I mean, when it comes to Europe, I guess the key issue here is that in terms of access, we're fine. It's about affordability. So energy poverty is something that quite a few parts of Europe are struggling with. And tackling that is for a great part, a question of social policy. So whether it's direct subsidies or checks to poor families and incomes and households, whether it is indirect ways of alleviating the burden for them, that's debatable. But social policy needs to watch out for the consequences of an increasing share of available income going into energy services to an extent that it's not sustainable anymore for individual households. And that's important for a whole bunch of reasons, including the social fabric. Because the moment people can no longer afford their energy services, and let's be totally clear, it's fossil fuels driving prices at the moment, it's not renewables driving prices. But going forward, we will see a situation where the CO2 price and the ETS, the carbon trading system, will slowly but surely push up prices for energy services. And that needs to be managed in such a way that, so it will be climate policies that do that. And that's precisely what they're supposed to do, because they're supposed to send a price signal to individual consumers to switch, to change behavior, to use different appliances. But the moment we do this, it becomes a question really of social cohesion, the social contract, popular support, acceptance, and all these kind of things. And that's precisely where we need to be very, very careful of the social consequences of rising energy prices. And that's energy poverty, in part fuel poverty. That's the biggest challenge that we're facing, I guess, in the EU. And I'm not entirely sure I got the second part of the question right, but there may be certainly consequences for other parts of the world at the moment when it comes to their energy security situation. In fact, there's two things that come to mind here. One, Europe, this country, is buying up all the LNG that they can find and get hold of at the moment in order to replace 100 billion cubic meters of Russian gas that they send west every year. Now, from a market perspective, that's fine. But the question then becomes, does the market react by way of adding supply? Or is supply more or less rigid, which means we're entering a price competition? And the answer is it's the second, because the supply of LNG is not flexible. It takes a lot of time to build additional liquefaction capacity. It comes online only after a couple of years, which means in Europe, in Germany, we're essentially buying up some of the capacity that otherwise would go elsewhere. We're talking about a zero-sum game. And we can do this because our purchasing power is higher than in other places, particularly in Southeast Asia. So the long and the short of it is we're in direct competition with China and Japan and South Korea. They can afford, but everyone else is priced out, including parts of India and other smaller consumers that probably will not even bother entering the LNG market anymore. It impacts their energy security, and particularly if they were banking on natural gas as a transition fuel to bridge some time between now and then in order to not go fossil, or not go coal at least, then that's out. They will probably now go for coal rather than natural gas. Now, you can argue that natural gas is a fossil fuel, so it emits a little bit less than coal, but it's not a great solution either. Absolutely right. And yes, it comes with their own path dependencies. So the moment you start putting in place additional LNG liquefaction or regasification facilities, this is going to stick around for a while. So you have similar problems. But still, it arguably would be better were they to go for a less polluting fossil fuel for some time rather than going for a different, more polluting fossil fuel. And that's probably what they're doing at the moment, given the constraints on the LNG market. So the answer is yes, there's a direct effect on others. It might just delay their policy choices. And on top of that, I mean, we're talking about tremendous bottlenecks when it comes to the kinds of technologies we all want, from solar panels to windmills and blades and all these kind of things, in part because of physical supply constraints, in parts because of clogged supply routes and supply chains. Now, the moment you put the European energy transition on steroids, you face a similar problem as in other technologies. You actually ask who pays most and first. So it's going to be probably Europe that gets their offshore wind farms. There's not going to be other parts of the world that come later and have a lower purchasing power, just to paint a very broad picture, which may also impact the degree to which they can go green on time if they want to. So yes, there is knock-on effects, and that simply has to do with all of these things being global markets. And we're all part of the same game here, unfortunately.
Yeah, my next question is about the trade-offs between the different SDGs that you've talked about, and also the challenge of closing the energy gap, the energy access gap. And my question would be if you think that biofuel energy can be part of the solution, and if yes, how? And how this affects the current pressure on food systems and food provision, and also the pressure on land that you mentioned during the lecture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I guess there's two aspects to this. One, what kind of technology are we talking? Because biofuels is not equals biofuels. You got first, second, and third generation. Essentially, that's what we're talking about. The moment you go third generation, we're at least out of the food fuel nexus, simply because you don't need necessarily, grains or corn or other primary commodities to produce alcohol or other biofuels. But that's a little bit of a subject of the future, because we're not at scale when it comes to those technologies. We're not able to produce at industrialized levels, which means we're essentially stuck with the technologies that are available, that are tested, that can produce at economic cost, and that's precisely where we get into the food fuel problem. And that is a problem that has been there already. I talked about indirect land use change and other things before. And now that problem became more evident even because of Ukraine and Russia's aggressive war. And even to the extent that Europe is now considering, the European Union and the Commission are now considering waiving biofuel blending requirements into regular gasoline in order to dampen additional demand on grains, corn, and other agricultural products, precisely because of the strained situation on global markets. So if you ask me, and I don't have that glass crystal ball in front of me, but if you ask me, I would say that it's going to be a very, very hard sell to tell anyone that biofuels is going to be a solution of the future, at least not against the backdrop of a looming food and hunger crisis this year, but also going forward. Just think about the second order effects that we're facing here. One is physical supply from Ukraine, stuff not leaving Ukrainian ports, physical supplies from Russia not coming through. And these are the two biggest corn producers and grain producers on the planet. But think about the second order effects. What you need to grow a good harvest is fertilizers. Fertilizers need what? Feedstock. That feedstock is natural gas for most part. Natural gas prices are in Europe hovering around 100 euros a megawatt hour at the moment. And they are flat out 100 megawatt hours all the way into Q1 23. What is 100 megawatt hour? Euro a megawatt hour? Well, that's about 5 times what we paid in September 21. So essentially, that's 5 times the regular price. And that also means, because of natural gas being an important feedstock for fertilizers, it also means that the prices for fertilizers will go through the roof. As a result of which, whatever the harvest is going to be next year, commodity prices in agricultural products will skyrocket, regardless of the primary effects that we're seeing right now. It's the second-order effects that I think we're looking at here next year, which, if you perpetuate all of this going forward, speaks against biofuels being part of the solution. They may be rather part of the problem.
Thank you very much for coming. It was really enjoyable lecture. On the first slide on SDG 7, I think you mentioned that the goal was reliable, sustainable and affordable energy and modern energy. And while I understand the first 3 terms, I don't understand the last one. Like, what does modern actually refer to? After all, windmills and water mills are some of the most ancient technologies that are known to humankind. So is it just a marketing slogan, or what does modern refer to? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I guess, I stand to be corrected here, but I guess there's no academic or scholarly definition of what a modern energy service is. That's essentially what the UN, how the UN defines it, and that's precisely what I put up there. I don't talk about modern energy services. What I talk about clean energy services typically, but what the UN means in the end by modern energy services is electricity, but electricity delivered in a way that it caters local needs and geographical realities when it comes to resource endowments. So modern energy services can be on-grid, produced by, say, wind farms. They can be off-grid, relying on locally produced electricity from solar, tidal, or whatsoever it is. And all of this comes with a sophisticated way of managing those grids in terms of supply and demand balance, the customer experience, and all the rest of it, and affordability, obviously. So what we're looking at here is systems that ideally are based on things like smart grids, ways to manage those despite, patchy availability of renewable energy resources and endowments and all the rest of it. That's essentially what modernity refers to, but it's not a scholarly term. It essentially is a good way of saying, let's get this right and let's get it up to speed and let's make sure people have access to electricity and reliable services that are clean and sustainable.
Hello. Thank you again for this interesting lecture. You've mentioned a lot about how governments have addressed this challenge at the international and national level, and I was wondering if it is realistic to say that civil society and NGOs can make a meaningful impact towards achieving SDG 7's goals, especially when state and market actors stall. And considering also that in order to achieve this transition to clean energy, it is required like a massive worth of infrastructure and also investments.
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely appreciate. I have talked a lot about states and markets and not about civil society and civil society actors. I think the big question is, what can civil society actors do? And they can do a lot of things. They can raise awareness. They can set an agenda. They can foster the cause of local communities. They can support the formulation of national energy policies when it comes to, for instance, what the energy mix should look like. They can become instrumental when it comes to public acceptance. They're an important player in participatory governance when it comes to siting decisions, for instance. and all these kind of things. They're an important mediator. But what they're not is they're not an investor. And I think this is absolutely crucial, because what we're talking about here is lots of money. We need to flip the global energy system, and we need to make sure that whatever comes next is not fossil. We're talking trillions of dollars every year. And that's what private investors need to do. Governments cannot do it. And that's precisely why I've tried to drive home how important the domestic investment environment is. It is not me being a neoliberal. It is essentially about me recognizing that governments don't have the clout to pull this off. So civil society is important in raising awareness and nudging and pushing things the right direction, in lobbying for clean energy choices rather than brown energy choices. And they have an important role to play in decision-making processes. But I think we would overcharge them and their role if we were to expect them to solve the problem. This is something that governments in the end need to do on various levels, in conjunction with private actors, as part of PPPs, which we're seeing in a lot of places, and together with, and embedded in decision-making processes that are stakeholder-based, particularly when it comes to local siting decisions. And that's precisely where civil society organizations have a great role to play. I think that's where I would locate them, and that's precisely where they have an important role to play.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you for this talk about energy governance, and it's maybe the most timely talk in our series. We now realize that energy security is an issue also of the global north again. But I also like that when it comes to energy transition, you emphasized that rich countries have to go first. Yeah. So, and against this backdrop, it's so sad to see how little investment there was. You showed the numbers in renewables in the last decades. So maybe there's one positive thing about this current crisis, that people wake up, and as you mentioned in the end, again, it's up to governments. Governments need to make the energy transition happening now, yeah? So there's some hope maybe, and you also mentioned PPPs in the end, public-private partnerships. So that's the topic of our next lecture, so very well done. But now, many thanks for coming and yeah, for this interesting talk, and also for the discussion with all of you. Thank you.